These include, according to the homepage, the politics of development, rural-urban migration, changing topographies of property and wealth, construction of space and place, urban culture in mining towns, experiences of modernity, the specialization of states, the place of Africa in a real and imagined world, and the theory and the politics of ethnography. Close quote. His first book, The Anti-Politics Machine, Development, Depoliticization, and the Bureaucratic Power in Lesotho, has remained a must for students who are interested in development. It clearly shows, according to Professor A.C. Kurimoto, who is right here, how anthropology is capable of dealing with the issue of development better than other disciplines. The second and third books, Expectations of Modernity, Myths and Meaning of Urban Life on the Zambian Copper Belt, and Global Shadows, Africa in the Neoliberal World Order, are essential sources for those who study modernity and globalization, in particular unfulfilled modernity and the dark side of globalization. His co-edited book, Anthropological Locations, Boundaries and Grounds of a Field Science, has been very widely read and quoted by those who are interested in the position of anthropologists in the globalizing world. I understand that he's now writing up a forthcoming book, provisionally titled Give a Man a Fish, Reflections on the New Politics of Distribution. So, Professor Ferguson is going to talk about rightful share beyond gift and market in the politics of distribution today. After about 1 hour of lecture, 2 discussants will join with their comments. Professor Akio Tanabe of Kyoto University and S.A. Kurimoto of Osaka University. Professor S.A. Kurimoto wrote to me, quote, I first came to know his work in 1985 by the bovine mystic, power, property, and livestock in rural Lesotho, one of his first articles published in Man. I, Professor Kurimoto, was impressed by its quality as ethnography. That was his starting point, and his career after that has been highly remarkable. What I, Kurimoto Sensei, admire about Professor Ferguson is that in him I find an ideal balance of being a prominent ethnographer and an excellent anthropologist at the same time. In principle, that is what we, all anthropologists, are supposed to be, but in reality, very few of us can achieve it. And that's why his works have been indispensable and enduring source of our understanding of modernity and globalization, with such a sophisticated theorization, while firmly based on the reality of everyday life. I'd like to invite Professor Ferguson to the podium for his address. Please welcome Professor Ferguson.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking our hosts, the IUAES, and of course the Japanese Society of Cultural Anthropology. And to thank especially our Secretary General, Professor Junzi Koizumi, for inviting me and for providing such a generous introduction. The theme of our meeting here is the future with/of anthropologies. I take the slash to be a friendly reminder that, to put it a bit crudely, if we don't find ways to make anthropological knowledge matter to the key issues of our own world's future, if we don't find our way to a future with anthropology, this will not bode well for the future of anthropology. Of course, we anthropologists are not, as we often insist, in the business of predicting the future, nor are we so self-important as to suppose that it is up to us to design it. Indeed, one of our disciplinary specialties seems to be critically exposing the hubris of those who imagine that they can simply impose their own desired futures from on high in the manner of the modernist social engineer. Yet this proud critical tradition should not inhibit us from recognizing that the different traditions of anthropological thought, anthropologies, if you like, may still have a great deal to say about both the kinds of futures that any of us might wish for and how we might go about achieving them. In that spirit, I here seek to apply an anthropological analysis to one of the key new developments to appear in recent years across much of the world. This is the emergence in a host of different sites across the global south of a major expansion of social welfare programs targeting the poor, anchored in schemes that directly transfer small amounts of cash to large numbers of low-income people via what are termed cash transfers. The central mechanism of these new anti-poverty programs is not microcredit or securitization, as some of our scholarly neoliberalism narratives might have led us to expect, but the startlingly simple device of handing out money to people deemed to need it. Whatever one might think of this outcome, it implies some quite different sorts of political possibilities and dangers than those implied by the usual anthropological accounts of neoliberalism. This talk, then, is drawn from a forthcoming book that seeks to provide a sustained reflection on these new worldwide developments and their political and social significance, with Southern Africa, a region I have studied for more than 3 decades, as its key point of focus. Southern Africa reveals the specifically political issues that are raised by these new programs in an especially acute way. So I want to begin by providing some context to the way that issues of distribution have been posed there, especially in South Africa and Namibia. This will perhaps help us to see how new apparatuses of direct distribution, such as those associated with programs of cash transfer, may be becoming bound up with new forms of what I call distributive politics. So, let me begin with one of the oldest and most intractable problems in the modern politics of the region: the problem of liberation and its meaning. Of all the promises that sustained the anti-colonial struggles across Southern Africa, perhaps none has been as elusive as the one expressed so economically in the 4th proclamation of South Africa's Freedom Charter. The people shall share in the country's wealth. This ringing declaration has inspired generations with its clear assertion that liberation must entail not just new political rights, but also a new distribution of resources. The people shall share in the country's wealth. Yet how such a result might be obtained remains underspecified. What exactly does it mean for the people to share in the country's wealth? In its day, the passage was widely understood to refer to nationalization. The paragraph that followed the declaration goes on to state that the national wealth, including the mineral wealth beneath the soil, quote, shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. This key formulation was widely interpreted as calling for the state ownership of at least the strategic sectors or so-called commanding heights of the economy, within which the mining industry inevitably looms large. But South Africa's ruling ANC party never took that path, and most of the regimes in the region that did nationalize major industries have since rethought the issue. While the state-owned mining company remains an internationally reputable model for natural resource extraction, the region's history has made clear that such nationalization by no means automatically leads to ordinary people, quote, sharing in the country's wealth. And the ANC today insists that it has no ambitions to nationalize major industries such as mining. Yet there continues to be a vigorous distributive politics in the region, and the old dream of a liberation in which the people might really share in the country's wealth remains very much alive. A recent wave of strikes in the South African mining industry reminds us of the continuing vitality of struggles around the division of the production pie between capital and labor. Yet while such spectacular struggles over distribution command massive media attention, the prospects for such actions bringing about a comprehensive sharing of the country's wealth with the people seem quite limited. Where higher wages have in fact been obtained, employers have tended to respond by employing fewer workers, limiting the overall distributive effect. And with the share of the population in a position to make such distributive claims shrinking, higher wages for organized formal sector workers can at best allow only a sharply limited, and in some ways privileged, subset of the people to share in the country's wealth. Struggles over wage labor, though, are very far from exhausting the domain of distributive politics in the region. Indeed, those excluded from the world of wages are making increasingly vocal claims to a share of distribution, often on grounds that make no reference to labor. Perhaps the most visible and certainly the most emotional site for such claims involves land and its distribution. Here, the key dynamic has involved populist economic demands made in the name of a politically empowered but economically marginalized majority. Often, the landless masses are invoked as the holders of an implicit property claim, not simply a political majority, but autochthons, the original and real owners of the country. A claim that brings with it both echoes of anti-colonial armed struggle and sometimes overtones of racist and xenophobic animus toward alleged foreigners and so-called settlers. Such demands for land have, with the exception of the much-discussed case of Zimbabwe, generally yielded little in the way of concrete results, even as the position of organized labor has mostly deteriorated across the region. At the same time, though, a more rewarding field of distributive struggle has emerged around what is called service delivery, a phrase that today evokes a broad package of goods and services, the provision of which, often on highly subsidized terms, is increasingly understood as a state responsibility to a deserving citizenry. These include such things as housing, electricity, sanitation, water, and social assistance. Claims to these services tend to be based not on labor, but on such things as citizenship, residence, identity, and political loyalty. Indeed, in discussions of this kind, jobs themselves sometimes seem to be conceived as simply another kind of good that the state ought to deliver. Ability to access services of this kind have been patchy, and failures are as notable as successes. South Africa, particularly, has delivered, as they say, millions of state-furnished houses, but equally evident are the millions more still living in shacks, and widespread demonstrations over failed service delivery. Yet in the midst of this fiercely contested landscape, there is one sort of service delivery that has indisputably had a major distributive effect. Programs of direct social assistance via cash grants that now directly reach 30% of South Africans, and indirectly far more than that, and that are also an increasingly important part of poor livelihoods in other Southern African countries. At first glance, militant political demands for state appropriation of land and industry would seem to have little connection with the sedate administrative world of social policy and cash transfers. Descriptively, certainly, the chauvinistic blood politics of racial ownership that I will discuss in a moment hardly resembles the gray technocratic machinations of the Social Security apparatus. And analytically, one is tempted to see radical challenges to the system of ownership of the means of production as quite fundamentally different from the merely ameliorative politics normally associated with social assistance. But I want to suggest that these two forms of politics are not as separate as they seem, and that bringing the two into relation raises some intriguing political possibilities. In particular, the existence of powerful political claims to ownership of a national wealth, when juxtaposed with a remarkably elaborate and effective apparatus of direct distribution, allows us to imagine and perhaps to see some preliminary flickers of a different kind of distributive politics, one that has affinities both with fundamental social principles of allocation familiar to anthropologists and with some of the most challenging recent thinking of philosophers and social theorists. That is a politics of what I call the rightful share. First, I here describe the way ideas of shares have figured in recent resource nationalism, especially in South Africa, and then reflect on the limits of such a politics. Second, I assess the achievements of the new programs of social assistance and note the way that they are limited by certain fundamental and persistent conceptions concerning the nature and purpose of social assistance. Finally, I consider a case, the Basic Income Grant campaign in Namibia, in which social assistance is being reimagined in ways that allow the idea of a rightful share to take on a quite different significance than it does in traditional discussions of nationalization of natural resources. South African politics has recently seen a burst of public debate around natural resources and the question of who rightfully owns them. Powerful assertions have been made of the people's right to quite directly share in the country's wealth, even of a right of the people to literally own such wealth. In the book chapter on which this talk is based, I explore at some length these lines of populist assertion, using the recent public statements of the South African politician Julius Malema. Malema has accumulated a legion of detractors who see him as a kind of clown or petty criminal at best, a so-called tenderpreneur who has enriched himself via his personal links with ANC cronies, and a dangerously illiberal demagogue at worst. And there's no doubt that Malema's undisciplined and ethically questionable conduct has led him into very serious political and personal setbacks. But both the crowds of enthusiastic supporters he has attracted in recent years among the poor and working classes, and the level of alarm and anxiety he has provoked among the propertied, suggest there's more going on here than just buffoonery or criminality. Instead, I suggest the Malema phenomenon provides a particularly clear window into a powerful strand of vernacular thinking about property, ownership, and justice. Press coverage of Malema has tended to focus most of all on his tendency to play on, if not actively to incite, sentiments of racial resentment and score settling, together with his weakness for loose and irresponsible threats of violence against white landholders. There is no doubt that a crude and demagogic racial politics is a key part of his populist appeal, as well as a key reason for the disdain expressed toward him by many pundits and mainstream politicians. But our understanding of the passions to which Malema gives voice will be incomplete if we see in them only a negative resentment and not also a positive aspiration. And that aspiration is not simply to democracy or political equality, but to something even more explosive and difficult to realize. It is an aspiration to ownership. How, he asks, does South Africa really belong to all of us when the majority of our people do not own anything? The most powerful symbol of such ownership, as it has been for generations across the region, is land. Land, with its indissociable link to place and ancestry, is readily associated with a so-called original ownership. Malema likes to taunt whites on this very point, asking them how much land they brought with them when they came from Europe. The Landless Peoples Movement makes a similar populist argument, echoing the restitution campaigns in Zimbabwe, saying simply, the land that was stolen from us must be returned. Give us our land now. But it is not just land that Malema demands. Just as the settlers did not bring land with them, he points out, neither did they bring minerals, which properly belong to the nation. There is more going on here, however, than mere us versus them claims of historical priority and original ownership. For Malema also deploys a powerful language of universalism, in which, as he puts it, everyone has the right to benefit from wealth in South Africa. In his most expansive accounts, South Africa's wealth should properly belong to all South Africans. All should be owners, and all should receive a share. And equality must mean not just political equality, but economic equality, which he understands as an equality of ownership. Ownership shared equally. As he told a Rustenburg crowd, quote, never apologize for demanding an equal share. But Malema moves very quickly from a diagnosis that calls for universalistic sharing among a vast plurality of owners to a remedy that calls for just a single owner, the state. Nationalization appears as the obvious, almost self-evident solution in this line of thinking. If the people rightfully claim the resources, then the nation as a whole should own them in the form of the state. History has shown the cost of this slippage. By a sleight of hand with which all students of socialism, African and otherwise, are only too familiar, the moral claims of the nation are appropriated by a state that turns out to be not the transcendent embodiment of the spirit of the people, but just an ordinary bureaucratic institution controlled by small numbers of very fallible mortals. And as even casual observers of African political economy know, the state can only too easily end up serving the private interests of those powerful elites who control the state apparatus. In this way, the people's claim of rightful ownership quickly becomes attached to the property claims of the state and those who control it. The empirical people become nominal owners of all, but actual owners of precious little. For Malema's critics, it is all too easy to visualize the path that would lead from nationalization to the looting of putatively national assets by a clique of well-connected cronies. As appealing as popular ownership is as a rhetorical demand, nationalization, in fact, does not begin to answer the real distributive questions. How can what is claimed to be a commonly owned wealth be actually shared in common? In fact, and not just as an ideological proclamation. How is the formidable stream of value produced by such national wealth, in fact, to be distributed? To whom and by what mechanisms? And where can the powerful distributive demands channeled by a figure like Julius Malema lead, if not to the dead end of state capitalism and elite enrichment? To answer these questions, we must consider in greater depth another, apparently quite different sort of distributive politics. As I have argued elsewhere, Southern Africa's new programs of social assistance have been a rare success story in the world of development and poverty policy. A substantial body of solid research demonstrates that programs of direct cash transfer, especially old age pensions and child support grants, have had real and impressive positive effects. In the midst of massive economic restructuring that has resulted in the shedding of many of the low-skilled jobs that once sustained poor and working-class communities across the region, social grants in those countries that have such systems have been hugely important in enabling children to be fed, retirees to be sustained with dignity in their old age, and destitution to be radically reduced. In a region that has for decades been littered with failed development and anti-poverty schemes, the demonstrated successes of these new and expanded systems of cash transfer are genuinely impressive. But as Andres du Toit has recently pointed out in a stimulating critique, such interventions directed against poverty have tended to, as he puts it, avoid confronting head-on the structural and systematic constraints that keep poor people marginalized. Instead, what he terms an anti-poverty consensus has settled on a depoliticized understanding of poverty as a simple lack experienced by individuals and households, rather than as an aspect of a social structure that has to be understood as a system of relations. The result is a framing of poverty that tends to sidestep the social clashes and vested interests that are integral to its production, and a process, in his words, of depoliticizing poverty and disconnecting it from questions of social conflict, inequality, and antagonism. In addition to this danger of depoliticization, there is another problem with the existing systems of cash transfers in the region. As I argue elsewhere, Southern African programs for addressing poverty via social assistance have continued to be modeled on the old European social democratic conception of the social, a conception that presumed a normal situation of widespread and near universal wage employment. For this reason, such programs have mostly avoided addressing the millions of healthy working-age men who are durably excluded from the world of employment. Payments of social grants therefore tend, in practice, to go largely to child-caring women and retired older people, and can respond only in a very limited and indirect way to the crisis created by the disappearance of the low-skilled manual laboring jobs that once sustained so much of the region. With so-called able-bodied men still anachronistically presumed to be workers, social assistance continues to be implicitly styled a sort of kindness shown to those who are in some way diminished, a framing that brings with it implications of incapacity, charity, and help for the helpless. In this form, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that the political possibilities raised by the new social assistance are indeed quite limited, perhaps as much so, if for different reasons, as are those raised by militant resource nationalism. Most progressives would surely agree that, flawed as they are, existing redistributive social programs are far better than nothing. But most will struggle to see in them anything approaching a genuinely radical or transformative politics either. Yet, as du Toit himself acknowledges, there may be more possibilities implicit in this vast and contradictory system of distribution than we have yet been able to appreciate. How might such potential be realized? Could a social apparatus that has proven admirably effective in delivering cash payments to the poorest be repurposed into something more transformative than a depoliticizing device for ameliorating poverty and helping the needy? Perhaps at least some significant part of an answer to these questions might start with a rethinking of the meaning of such payments. In particular, the idea that a social payment might be understood not as aid, assistance, gift, or charity, but instead as a kind of share. The next section develops this conception, and the following one makes the argument more than hypothetical by showing the way an idea of a rightful share is being put to use in one specific empirical context. Social assistance is specified in the South African Constitution as a right, but it is in practice widely understood as fundamentally motivated by a kind of generosity. In this way, it is often implicitly styled as a kind of unreciprocated gift, assistance or help, granted, as we say, to the needy and the unfortunate, motivated by such things as kindness and compassion. With social payments construed as generous gifts, questions arise, as they generally do with asymmetrical gifts, about failed reciprocity. What does the recipient of a social payment owe in exchange to society? And about dependence. Is it healthy or dignified to be dependent, to get, quote, something for nothing, to receive handouts? The reliance here on a quasi-anthropological paradigm of the gift is generally left implicit, but it was made explicit by one of the foundational thinkers of the British welfare state, Richard Titmuss. And I have a critique of Titmuss here, which I will cut for time. The gist of it is that it is misguided to think of social assistance according to the paradigm of the gift. But perhaps I want to suggest anthropology can furnish a more suitable concept. Students of non-market systems of distribution, from Malinowski to Eleanor Ostrom, have documented the existence of complex systems for the allocation of resources or valued assets, to which an entire collectivity is understood to have rights, rights of access, of use, of consumption. These systems, being governed by intricate social rules, are never a matter of free and unfettered use of the common, but neither are they necessarily well conceived in terms of gift exchange. Rather, they provide ways of answering distributive questions, who gets what, in ways that typically have little to do with either markets or gift exchange, but rest instead on the principle of allowing to each a proper or rightful share. When chiefs lay down rules, as they have historically done all across southern Africa, governing the use of pasture land for grazing, for instance, or when a hunter returns with his prey and proceeds to allocate the meat to a range of others, the key dynamic is not gift and return, but the proper and just division of a whole to which all have a claim. Sharing has long been identified by anthropologists as a key feature of human sociality, especially within small groups. It was once common to assimilate these practices of sharing within the frame of reciprocity, as in Marshall Solons's generalized reciprocity. But more recent scholarship is adamant that, in James Woodburn's fine phrase, sharing is not a form of exchange. Attention to what Nicholas Peterson has termed demand sharing, in particular, has illuminated the need both to distinguish processes of allocation from the giving of gifts, and to take note of the gap between Western ideas of sharing as a form of generosity and practices that in fact operate according to another logic altogether. In a revealing overview of sharing in foraging societies, Woodburn insists that the much discussed sharing of meat in these societies is organized not around gifts or exchanges, but rather the aggressive demands of those who receive shares. What we may see as donation, he points out, is in fact obligatory, and recipients feel themselves to be fully entitled to the meat they receive. Nor is there any expectation of reciprocity. Men who never hunt, he notes, also receive meat, and this does not in any way affect their entitlement. The hunter who shares the meat is neither celebrated nor thanked, and in fact has little choice over who will receive the meat, which has to be given to everyone in the camp. Thomas Whitlock has expanded this account, noting that, quote, the ethnographic record shows that sharing typically takes the form of demand sharing, rather than apparently generous gift giving, end quote. And that in contrast to gift exchange, it is typically unceremonial and characteristically initiated by recipients, who may, in his words, be critical rather than grateful, insulting the meat, accusing the hunter, and so on. Richard Brinker, in his work on forager-farmers interactions in what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has also noted the error of imposing an exchange model on processes of sharing. When Efe hunters come into farming villages with meat and other goods they have obtained from the forest, they transfer a portion of these goods to laissez farmers, with the farmers in this way obtaining meat and other valued forest goods, while the hunters take away grain and other agricultural products. But what Western observers have generally seen as an obvious situation of exchange or barter is in fact described by the participants very differently. Each hunter is linked to a family of farmers via shared membership in a so-called house, and the goods of both field and forest are understood to properly belong to the house as a whole. They must therefore be divided among its members. The process is described not as an exchange, but by using a verb that refers principally to sharing or division. The rearrangement of goods is understood as a division or distribution of a commonly owned whole into shares. As Grinker puts it, quote, "Those things circulated are transferred between people who already have rights in them. The laissez-faire relationship is founded not on exchange or purchase, but rather on the distribution of common and shared goods," end quote. Dividing a resource rightfully owned by a group into appropriate shares is not a process unique to foraging societies. As I've argued elsewhere, the rightful share is also a very familiar part of modern capitalist societies. And corporate capitalism is in fact built not on private property, as is often ideologically insisted, but on property held in common by a membership group, a corporation. Property which is carefully divided into shares. Indeed, given the prominence of the cultural and legal form of the share in modern corporate capitalism, the question our societies face is not really, shall we cooperate and share as members of groups or instead compete as individuals? It is, who will have shares, who will be members of what corporate groups, and how will shares and dividends be divided? Given all this, perhaps the paradigm of the gift is the wrong place to start in thinking about social transfers. What if a poor person could receive a distributive payment neither as a reciprocal exchange for labor or good conduct, nor either as an unreciprocated gift, but instead as a share, a rightful allocation due to a rightful owner? At a stroke, many of the most troubling problems of social assistance vanish. Stigma, humiliation, shame, the lack of self-worth associated with getting something for nothing, and so on. In fact, if payments can be conceived as rightful shares, that is, as allocations properly due to rightful owners, then there is no expectation of a return, no debt, and no shame. No one is giving anyone anything. One is simply receiving one's own share of one's own property. Is there any evidence that such a recontextualization of social payments is underway? Let us consider some Southern African material. In fact, the meaning of a social payment in today's Southern Africa seems to be largely up for grabs. In some very substantial measure, of course, social payments are still styled assistance to the needy, with continuing gift-like connotations of charity, compassionate for the unfortunate, and so on. A new and more neutral language of cash transfers here competes with a still very vital older regional language of grants, which the term implies must be the work of a generous grantor. But there are also alternative conceptions at play. One classical anthropological diagnostic for distinguishing a share from a gift is that the response to a share may be critical rather than grateful, and involve, as Vidlock has noted, practices of complaint or derision, such as insulting the meat. There may be something of this in the social practices of receiving pensions and grants. From the anecdotal material I've managed to collect, at least, it seems that at the concrete occasions of distribution, when pensions and grants are received from government pay points, neither expressions of gratitude nor praise poems to the benevolent state are particularly prominent. Instead, the complaint is that the payments are too small, the government is stingy, there are administrative problems, and so on. The meat is insulted, not praised. Perhaps we may detect a hint here that social payments may be being seen, at least by some, not as gifts for which one should feel grateful, but as something that one has coming, something that is delivered to you precisely because it is your due. The most fully developed elaboration of the idea of social transfers as rightful shares, however, comes from Namibia. There, the strong language of ownership that one sees in discussions around the nationalization of minerals and land has also started to appear in at least some sorts of claims on social assistance. In recent years, a vigorous campaign has been conducted for a so-called basic income grant, BIG, or BIG, a minimum monthly state payment of 100 Namibian dollars, which was at the time it was proposed about 16 US dollars, to be paid to each and every individual Namibian without condition or qualification. The campaign is innovative and interesting in a number of ways, as I have discussed at some length elsewhere. But my interest in it here is in the way arguments promoting it have invoked both a duty to share on the part of the state and a conviction that ordinary Namibians have a very specific and concrete sort of right to share in the country's wealth. Like Julius Malema, but in a very different context, BIG proponents insist that citizens are also owners. For this reason, a social payment such as a basic income grant must be understood not as aid, charity, safety net, or even social wage, but as a rightful share. A share of what already, by rights, belongs to each Namibian, the country's wealth. Most bluntly, as one BIG activist put it, the state must take from the rich and support the poor. That is the model of sharing we are proposing. In a country that is considered the most unequal in the world, he argued, that is the way to go, have the state intervene to create a society of sharing, his phrase. But this is not just a vague appeal for generosity. Instead, it is linked to specific distributive demands grounded in specific moral and political arguments. Analysis of discussions about poverty, inequality, and social policy in Namibia reveals that there are several different models for sharing in play, including models based on metaphors of familial relationship and Christian communion. Here, though, I focus on just one of these models, a model of sharing based on citizen ownership of a share of national wealth. And here, the question of mineral resources and the rightful distribution of the wealth that they produce has been absolutely central. In a recent interview, for instance, one activist insisted that the national liberation struggle in Namibia was not yet complete, since that struggle had always been a struggle for a Namibia, quote, where every Namibian has a decent life and a decent living. What is more, he went on, the country can afford to give every Namibian a decent living because of the natural resources that we've been blessed with, the wealth we are generating. Social assistance in the form of a basic income grant is thus in the first instance a matter of sharing what is properly a national birthright. And this, he insisted, was not just a matter of sympathy or even of good policy, it is a matter of right. We argue that it is not just a benefit that people should get, it is also a right that they should enjoy as citizens of this country. Such claims regularly occur in the vigorous discussions over the BIG in the Namibian public sphere as well. Letters written to the daily newspaper, for instance, illustrate well both the general link between social payments and a rightful share of mineral wealth, and the specific theme of inheritance or birthright. One letter to the editor of the national daily newspaper, for instance, insisted that Namibia's rich resources should provide, quote, a decent living for each of its citizens. For that reason, it is the basic right of each Namibian to directly benefit from the resources of the country. In the same way, BIG is every citizen's basic right. Another insisted, the problem is not that there are not adequate resources to go around for everyone. There is enough on this earth for everyone to live a sufficient life. The real problem is that resources are not fairly distributed. That is the main issue. It is all about distribution, end quote. Another letter insists that a BIG is due to all. Quote, the mere fact of being a Homo sapien, or if you like, a Namibian citizen, should be sufficient to qualify. Because, quote, the historical situation is that the capitalist economy now only needs a small number of people in full-time employment. Those who object to giving money to people who do not work, the letter's authors insist, should look around and observe, quote, the offspring of the rich in Namibia. They certainly do not work for a living. They inherit the wealth and do not have to lift a finger. Most of the wealth today is transferred through inheritance. This is one of the main reasons why the ideology of work is so false, end quote. Perhaps the most prominent public advocate of the grant, Bishop Kameta of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Namibia, directly links the idea of basic income to a notion of citizenship, rooted both in a moral model of the house and in a rightful entitlement to a material share of national wealth. Thanks to its rich mineral resources, he noted in an interview, Namibia as a country is rich. Quote, "We are living in a mansion, we are living in a villa." But if a nation is a house, citizenship means being part of the house. And he went on to say, if only some of the children are eating in the house and some are starving, I think that is not right. What does citizenship mean, the bishop asked. Does it mean, well, you must be proud that you have an identity document? But that's more helpful to the police, to locate where you are. Instead, he said, let citizenship not start with the official documents, but start with the sharing of the resources. Citizenship should mean that I partake in the wealth of the country, end quote. Here it is possible to observe a kind of convergence in which the muscular assertions of ownership that we see in Malema-style resource nationalism are being harnessed to concrete and universalistic distributive claims, claims that are made both plausible and practical by the new cash transfer apparatuses that deliver existing forms of social assistance. And while I've tried to illustrate this sort of reasoning by dwelling on one especially clear case, the recent Namibian BIG campaign, I emphasize that the idea that universalistic cash payments might be reconceptualized as a kind of share of collectively owned mineral wealth is not unique to Namibia. Indeed, a recently launched region-wide campaign argues for a basic income grant scheme that would be funded by levies on mineral extraction covering the entire Southern African Development Community region. The slogan emblazoned on the campaign's logo reads as follows, quote, "Our right, our wealth, our share." Let me conclude by suggesting that in all of this, it may be possible to detect an emergent politics. Such a politics is based on a kind of claim-making that involves neither a compensation for work nor an appeal for help, but rather a sense of rightful entitlement to an income that is not tied either to labor or to any sort of disability or incapacity. At the most fundamental level, such distributive claims do not take the form of exchanges at all, neither market nor gift, but instead something more like demand sharing, a righteous claim for a due and proper share, grounded in nothing more than membership in a national collectivity, or even simply presence. It is this emergent, only partially realized politics that I term the politics of the rightful share. And my claim is that in a range of societies, especially where wage labor has lost the political and economic centrality it once had, it may be becoming a much more prominent and important form of political aspiration. How are we to assess the potential of such a politics of the rightful share? Let's begin by considering where and why claims to rightful shares are politically potent and do manage to gain some traction. It seems to be the case that share reasoning is most readily accepted when it comes to mineral wealth. Why is that? If a small farmer works hard to grow a modest agricultural crop on some little patch of land, we readily accept the idea that the goods so produced belong to him or her, and not to us all collectively. But if the same farmer finds oil on that little piece of land, installs a few cheap pumps, and starts earning billions, we easily conclude that at least some share of that wealth is, or ought to be, common. Why? Because I think the value is so out of proportion to the effort. In some sense, we recognize that the value was already there, stumbled upon, not created by the farmer. Immense value, that is, here emerges not from labor, but fabulously, almost magically, as if from nowhere. But mineral extraction is not the only place where the proportionality of wealth to effort that we see in the case of the small farmer is absent. Indeed, a disconnection of accumulation from such things as work, effort, and duration has been noted to be a distinguishing feature of the current era of what has been called casino capitalism.
In fact, the morality of the unearned oil bonanza is not easily distinguished from similar gushers that nowadays spray torrents of money out of hedge funds, currency speculation, and executive compensation agreements. But as I have pointed out elsewhere, the same is true in a different way, even of such pillars of the so-called real economy as manufacturing, at least in the most up-to-date and capital-intensive end of things. In fact, a high-tech factory is today not so different from an oil rig, a huge piece of capital investment that, once in place, pumps out unimaginable amounts of valuable stuff with only small amounts of supervisory labor. The distributive claims that are plausible for mineral wealth thus become increasingly plausible for other forms of wealth as well. For they, too, now seem to appear fabulously, magically, as if from nowhere. Distributive claims of this kind, that is, grounded in membership rather than labor or misfortune, are, I have suggested, increasingly evident in certain new domains of social policy, both in Southern Africa and internationally. The legitimacy of such claims is a key theme, too, in much contemporary radical social thought, especially in a recent revitalization of thinking about what is an old topic for socialism, the commons. David Harvey, of course, has in recent years revisited Marx's old discussion of primitive accumulation of common property. But more interesting for my purposes here are lines of thought that lie outside of the well-rehearsed verities of Harvey's traditional production-centered Marxism, and that derive instead from alternative formulations of socialism that give a greater place to distribution, formulations to which it may be time, I suggest, to return. For instance, the anarcho-communist Peter Kropotkin founded his critique of capitalism not on arguments about labor and production, but on a fundamentally distributive claim, the claim that society's wealth properly belongs to all. Every member of modern industrial society, he noted, benefits from what he called an immense capital accumulated by those who have gone before him. And among those wealth-creating predecessors, he paid special attention to poor and working people and their sufferings. Quote, whole generations that lived and died in misery, oppressed and ill-treated by their masters, and worn out by toil, have handed on this immense inheritance. Yet the descendants of those who paid this terrible price, instead of being treated as the inheritors of a vast richness, are denied any property rights at all. For all the vast wealth produced by modern railways, for instance, he wrote, quote, if the children of those who perished by the thousands while excavating the railway cuttings and tunnels were to assemble one day, crowding in their rags and hunger, to demand bread from the shareholders, they would be met with bayonets and grape shot. Importantly, Kropotkin does not say that such a person deserves a share of wealth because he or she works a certain amount. On the contrary, the entire production apparatus must be treated as a single common inheritance. I therefore deserve a share of production not because I labor, but because I own, via inheritance, a share of the entire production apparatus. Kropotkin appeals to labor, to be sure, but not just the labor of the present. Instead, it is past labor that is most fundamentally the source of the productive apparatus that we all inherit. So the heritage of labor is as important as its current condition. What is more, he grounds the right to a common inheritance not just in a long shared history of work, but equally in other historical accumulations, such as inventions, as well as forms of suffering, deprivation, and bloodshed. In this broad panorama, which encompasses the whole history of all of mankind, there can be no accounting of who produced how much or whose suffering was greater. The only practical as well as ethical conclusion is, as he famously put it, all belongs to all. More recently, autonomists have revitalized this old tradition of theorizing about the common. I don't have time to discuss this here, but there are a number of interesting discussions, both in the realm of general social and political theory and in the specific context of South African politics, that follow Kropotkin's lead in linking distributive claims to the social origin of value, while making quite specific proposals for income distribution in the form of basic income cash transfers. It is not my purpose to attempt to assess or arbitrate these debates here. My point, rather, is simply to point to their existence and to note that the intersection of new kinds of welfare states with new kinds of thinking about distribution has created a powerful conjunctural moment, one that I would like to suggest is as full of possibilities as it is of dangers. My claim in calling attention to these new developments is not that they are unequivocally wonderful or that they solve all of our problems, but only that they are important and that they may be opening possibilities for new kinds of politics. In particular, I suggest that the new welfare states of the Global South and the new kinds of political claim-making that are emerging within them may contain two linked potentialities. One is the possibility that the considerable political energies activated by Julius Malema's sort of resource nationalism might, under the conditions of the new welfare states, manage to find more productive outlets than old-style demands for nationalization. And the second is that programs of cash transfers might conceivably, in the years to come, be expanded and developed in ways that would take them far beyond the merely ameliorative and largely apolitical aims that govern current schemes, and become instead sites for the development of a potent new distributive politics. How much difference would this make? Potentially a lot, I think. Consider the difference between receiving assistance and receiving an ownership share, what I have called a rightful share. What would change? First of all, social payments would become accessible to a much broader set of recipients, including able-bodied 18 to 59-year-olds, casting aside age-old presumptions about who deserves to receive payment, and severing the link between income and labor in a quite fundamental way. Equally important, those already receiving payments would also see a fundamental change, in that even an unchanged payment would bring with it a very different social significance. Framed as a rightful share, a transfer might bring with it not just some modest material resources, but a new and powerful social identity, owner. The people shall share in the country's wealth. The key unanswered question here has always been, how? How a wealth of which all ought to have at least some share can in fact be meaningfully shared. Proponents of Malema-style nationalization have never managed to supply an adequate answer to that. And neither, it must be said, have socialist theorists of either the Marxian or the anarchist stripe. But the intersection of a demand for rightful shares with a bureaucratic apparatus for direct payments opens up concrete new possibilities that are only now beginning to be explored. New kinds of welfare states, that is, may open up the possibility of imagining new kinds of politics, perhaps even new kinds of socialism. Distributive claims, after all, may rest on the most compelling ethical and political rationales, but they can lead to actual distributive outcomes only to the extent that there exists an effective and universal apparatus of distribution. Without that, even the most assertive gestures of common ownership, such as nationalization, are unlikely to have genuinely distributive outcomes, as we have learned only too well. The new welfare states in places like Namibia and South Africa are in fact creating such apparatuses of distribution, and thereby putting into place, unintentionally I think, a precondition for a different kind of resource politics, one that could be socialist in a very different sense than traditional nationalization. That is hardly an assured outcome, perhaps not even a likely one, but it is an intriguing possibility and perhaps a hopeful point of aspiration on which to focus a new form of progressive political practice. And the existence of such political possibilities, to return to our conference theme, may also give us a chance to see how new ways of deploying the conceptual resources of our discipline's past might help us to imagine pathways toward both futures and anthropologies worth wishing for. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to invite first Professor Akio Tanabe to the podium. To the podium, probably. Professor Ferguson's paper offers a thought-provoking insight into the potentialities of new politics centered on the idea of the rightful share of the people in the country's wealth. It represents a rare combination of the finest anthropological tradition with most recent social theory that is relevant to and has taken inspiration from the actual and important political issue in the contemporary world. There are several important contributions this paper offers to the anthropological studies. First, this paper contributes towards clarifying conceptual categories. He correctly distinguishes distribution or sharing from gift giving. Second, he points to the importance of paying attention to the new programs of direct distribution as a topic of study, which are opening up possibilities for new kinds of politics in the global south. Third, he sees possibilities of new politics beyond resource nationalism and ameliorative welfare in the intersection of idea of a rightful share with a bureaucratic apparatus for direct payments. This shows how he carefully engages himself with not only ideas, but also practical concerns for new politics. Professor Ferguson is indeed a serious and creative thinker on how anthropology can actually contribute towards making better human futures. He is careful enough to state that the programs of direct distribution is, quote, as full of possibilities as it is of dangers, end quote. I entirely agree with him. However, since he seems to have put more emphasis on their possibilities rather than their dangers and limitations, I would like to raise some points for discussion. First, Professor Ferguson is for the idea of the people having rightful share. I agree in general. But the real political questions are, as pointed out in the paper, who are the people and how much of which resources is the rightful share for whom? Professor Ferguson is for the idea of the common ownership of national wealth. But such idea alone will not provide answers to these sensitive and complex questions. For example, from my field, there is the Dongria Kondo tribe who live on bauxite-rich hills in eastern India. A multinational wish to dig out the bauxite for aluminium production. Should we allow that and distribute the wealth equally to all Indian citizens? Would not the Dongria Kondo have the right to stay on, or at least have some special entitlements in the shares? We need democratic political means to decide on these complex questions. Second, then the next question would be, can the programs of direct distribution be politically transformative rather than a depoliticizing device? This is a question also Professor raises in the paper. Professor Ferguson's answer is yes, with the idea of social payment not as aid or gift, but as a kind of share. I agree that the transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor would have a stronger ideological ground with this idea. However, the political question of how much of which share for whom remains unresolved. Although the idea of the people as a whole having ownership over the commons of national wealth indeed is powerful for rectifying inequality, it also has the homogenizing effect that ignores the diversity of citizens who have different positionalities and histories and thus different claims to various services and resources. The programs of the direct distribution with powerful bureaucratic apparatus may succeed in providing shares to those who are categorized as the low income, regardless of race, caste, and gender, and that is indeed a great possibility in ameliorating poverty. But it also means that any politics based on differences other than poverty would have no space. It is indeed depoliticizing in this sense.
In order for democratic politics to take place, we need a space of agency for intermediate groups with diverse viewpoints, personalities, and the end claims. However, the very mechanism of direct distribution is such that it connects the state with the entitled individuals, or at best with local governments, without allowing thick intermediate layers of society to play any role. Third, in this regard, I would like to touch upon the importance of the gift exchange as a way of establishing diverse and distinct subjecthoods of groups and individuals. While I wholeheartedly agree with Professor Ferguson that we should pay more attention to the importance of distribution in a community, I also would like to suggest, in accordance with anthropological tradition, that it is the gift exchanges that establish subjects in communication and negotiation with each other. In 18th century India, upon which I conducted historical anthropological studies, there was indeed what I call the system of entitlements, where different social groups received shares of local products. However, these groups also had reciprocal exchange relationships with each other. It was the fine mixture of distribution and exchange that provided the space for both cooperation and negotiation in a community with diverse population. Fourth, further, in this connection, I'd like to ask Professor Ferguson how he locates the case of direct distribution in anthropological theory of sharing that has mainly dealt with distribution in a community rather than in the state. Marcel Mauss saw socialist potentialities in cooperatives in this line. The idea of direct distribution looks rather statist than socialist in anthropological tradition. Would not that be privileging the state at the cost of society? Fifth, my last question is related to the framework of understanding today's economy. The shift of focus from production to distribution can indeed be justified to rectify protectionist bias. However, we cannot just look at the distribution process if we are to look at, quote, entirety of social life, end quote. By concentrating on distribution, we may end up allowing neoliberal capitalist regime to take full swing in production, only adding end up allowing neoliberal capitalist regime to take full swing in production, only adding redistributive measures as an ex post facto amendment. Distribution could be talked about as rightful shares, as political assertion, I agree with that. But in socio-economic terms, perhaps we should plan the distribution as a means for improving people's capability, life chances, and agency, thus providing the basis for future people-centered, rather than capital-centered, economic development. If not, the redistributive measures by the state will continuously be seen as an unwelcome intervention that hampers the efficiency of the market. This will limit the potentialities of the politics of rightful shares. I suggest the potentialities of people-centered economic development, as it seems to be a real possibility, at least in India or in Indonesia. The ratio of so-called informal economy, comprising of small-scale production and led by the economic demand from the people, is quite large in India and Indonesia. Here, direct distribution functions to enhance low-income people's capability to take part in such informal economies. It shows another aspect of today's emerging economies that is different from what is called casino capitalism. Do you see any such possibilities in Southern Africa? If not, are there any ways to shift the form of economics itself, rather than direct distribution just politically complementing and thus, in effect, preserving the casino capitalism? To conclude, I am of the opinion that direct contribution by the state is a measure which in itself does not provide a basis for new socialism or democracy, but is useful as a way of enhancing human agency of the marginalized, and thus preparing the social basis for more egalitarian democratic politics and market economy. For it to be successful, however, we must carefully establish the democratic means to decide on the political question of how much of which share for whom, which requires a lot of bureaucratic, informational, technological, and political innovations. What the direct distribution may potentially bring about is indeed exciting and worth paying attention to, as Professor Ferguson rightly and clearly demonstrates.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the second commentator, Professor Keynote.
Thank you. For our grand theme, the future with of anthropologies, the issue of state or state-society relations seems to be of essential importance. It is said that in this age of globalization, the model of modern nation state and that of welfare state in particular is no longer valid as it used to be. And yet we still do not have a new alternative model of state today. In Japan, for about 2 decades, we have been told again and again by the media and by our political leaders that the national treasury is almost bankrupted and is going to be surely bankrupted soon. And therefore, the government can no longer be so generous to provide basic services, or it is not able to distribute the national wealth to its own nationals. In Japan, it is happening at the same time when the state is required a new definition of citizenship and nationality, and at the international level, redefinition of bilateral relations is going on regarding who is an ally and friend to Japan and who is not. Then, South Sudan is the newest sovereign state in the world that became independent in 2011 after a 20-year bloody and devastating civil war. I have been conducting anthropological research in and on South Sudan for the last 35 years. There in South Sudan, the hottest national debate has been how the national wealth, that is oil, petroleum, should be shared. First, with the neighboring Sudan. Second, among its own people. I have mentioned the 2 cases of Japan and South Sudan because the issues of rightful share and distributive politics, the 2 key points of the keynote lecture seems to be fundamental, not only in understanding the 2 cases, but also in conceiving an appropriate and new model of state. Then I just want to give one short and quick comment on Julius Malema's phrase. Demanding of people's right of ownership and its translation into the state ownership seems to me very similar to the idea of Thomas Hobbes in his argument on the relation between individuals' natural rights and their transfer to the state. I would like to argue that Marema considers people's right to natural resources as one of the natural rights which needs to be transferred to the state. And if we think in that way, it is apparent that the transfer alone will not solve the problem. In the last part of my comments, I will discuss the case of Ethiopia, where the World Bank Group and other donor institutions started a new type of massive financial support in 2006. And in fact, last year, I had a contract with World Bank to work as expert consultant for the inspection panel in Gambela region of Ethiopia, where I conducted field work in the 1980s and 90s. What I am talking now has been acquired through that experience with the World Bank. The Ethiopian case, for me, seems to be an interesting example of distributive politics at the international level. It is indeed a new type of cash transfer between the World Bank Group and other donors, other donor institutions, and the recipient government. Ethiopia has been one of the best partners of development in African continent. The economic growth at the national level, which is almost 10% annual growth, has been highly remarkable. And it may be among a few African countries where most of the MDGs of UN would be achieved. So it is considered, Ethiopia has been considered a success case. In terms of the shape of state, Ethiopia adopted a unique system of state structure in the mid-1990s, which is called ethnic federalism, and which is coupled with decentralization. So this new World Bank project is called Protection of Basic Services, PBS project, that started in 2006, and the first phase continued for 3 years, and the second year for 3 years again, and now it is in the third phase. And during the first phase, the total amount of budget provided by donors amounted up to 1.2 billion US dollars, and during the second phase, it amounted up to 2 billion. And out of which about 40% were provided by the World Bank Group. And the point is that those money went directly to the national treasury, and then down to the treasuries of local governments. And the money has been used for the training and payment of government workers at the local level working in the fields of education, health and sanitation, water supply, safe drinking water, rural roads, and agriculture to provide better service, basic services to the people. The project seems to be very successful, at least at the official level, and the standard of health and education, it is true that have been very much improved. And at the moment, so far, we have had very few serious criticism of this PBS project. But I would like to argue that one of the problems is that first, there is no exit strategy. I mean, when the supply of grants is over next year, the government will not financially be able to continue employing such huge number of officials. You know, there are hundreds of thousands officials who are newly employed, and the government has no capacity to continue paying money for them. That is one point. And the second point, another criticism that is more fundamental than the first one would be that the issue of depoliticization of the poverty. The same criticism that the Professor Ferguson mentioned on the case of cash transfer in the Southern Africa. And I want to say that the provision of better basic services does not necessarily contribute to the reduction of or amelioration of poverty. But this issue has never been seriously discussed. Then the third point, you know, about this World Bank PBS project is that this is not really criticism, but a point, important point to be made, and that is this money given by the World Bank to the government of Ethiopia has never been conceived as our right, our wealth, our share. And there is no sense of being members of one society or a community between the recipients and the givers. And of course, to cultivate that sort of the shared identity between the two is not at all a part of Professor Ferguson's keynote lecture. I think I stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that you have got a lot to say in response to those comments, so please.
I'm just aware we've kept people here for a long time as it is, so perhaps I should just keep my response quite short. Okay. First of all, thanks very much to Professor Tanabe and Kurimoto. These are very thoughtful and provoking comments that are going to help me to think about these issues more in the future.
Let me begin with Professor Korimoto's comments. He points out the way that the kind of political dynamic that I identified is both present and absent in a number of other cases. Present in the questions of what people expect from the state and their notion of who is entitled and why are of quite wide applicability. But limited as well in that the Ethiopian case that he discusses, for instance, involves a flow of money which is not understood as belonging to the people within the country, but is understood as something that is external, that is the property of the government, that is meant to be translated into government services at best. Here I think I'm struck, one of the comments that Professor Korimoto made is that Ethiopia has been a success story and has enjoyed high growth rates in recent years. That's true of many African countries, actually. We have to kind of adjust our thinking and realize that some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. It's no longer obvious that things like poverty policies have to be funded by outside agencies like the World Bank. And if Ethiopia has such a booming economy, one wonders why aren't there poverty programs that do precisely draw on the wealth of the country in order to make distributive claims on it, which would probably not be something the government is welcoming, but might give a basis for a different kind of politics of development. The other thing that strikes me is the expansion of this idea of services. I mean, we've always understood that states should provide services to their citizenry and that that's one of the things people feel that they have some entitlement to. What's new in the cases I'm dealing with, relatively new, is the idea that provision of income is one of those services. Right? That is, like education and healthcare, one of the basic packages of things governments ought to do is to provide people with a certain kind of floor for an income. That, I think, changes the whole idea of what services are. One of the problems with all these development projects over the years has been some planner and some capital decides what people need and sets up a program to deliver it to them. One of the great virtues of giving people money is that they can decide for themselves what they need. That's one of the reasons why cash transfer programs have been more effective than a lot of other anti-poverty programs. It's precisely because of the kind of humility that's built in, the presumption that people know their problems better than those who would transform them. Let me turn briefly to Professor Tanabe's challenging comments. I agree with them almost entirely. I want to be clear that when I tried to describe something emerging in the cases that I'm concerned with, especially Namibia and South Africa, what it is that is emerging is not a model, not a successful model which I think ought to be implemented. What is emerging I described as a politics. And the questions that have been so acutely put here are all questions that have to be answered through that politics. They will not be answered by the theorist or the ethnographer, but they are questions that will have to be answered. I don't think it's a question of shall we have a politics of distribution or shall we not? You know, does Ferguson think we ought to have one? Well, nobody cares what Ferguson thinks. There is a politics of distribution, it's happening, and I'm describing it. I'm seeing it happen and trying to figure out what it means. But I don't think we have a choice as to whether or not we're going to be fielding distributive claims that are based on things other than labor, for instance. You know, you've got maybe 30% of the entire population unemployed. They're going to be making other kinds of demands. And the question is, what form will those take, and what kinds of possibilities and dangers, as I say, can we identify? I think you've done a good job of doing what I didn't do in the paper, which is identifying some of those dangers. Let me just say very quickly that I think you identify the fact that cash transfers do not have a very thick or robust effect in terms of constituting a certain kind of society. I agree, and I think that's what's interesting about them. I think the advocates of things like basic income are precisely attempting to create a form of state intervention which is both absolutely massive and completely minimalistic. So, for instance, the child support grants in South Africa, Namibia as well, they are paid to the caregivers of children. Anybody under the age of 18 is a child, a certain amount of money is dispensed for their care. To who? To whoever is caring for them. Unlike a lot of social welfare programs in the past which said, well, we know what a proper family looks like. We're going to use these resources as a tool to craft the proper kinds of families. They have to have households, they have to have heads, there ought to be husbands and wives. They've jettisoned all of that. And they've said, actually, we don't care. It doesn't have to be a relative. It doesn't have to be the mother. They don't have to be living with, we don't care who they're living with. They can be living by themselves. They can be living with a same-sex lover. They can be living with absolutely anybody. There is no attempt to create a kind of social structure. And it's again based on this idea that people know their own domestic needs and potential solutions better than we do. We will refrain from trying to impose what we think is the right family structure because we don't know what the right family structure is. And I think that's an interesting rationality of government that's emergent here. And as you say, it's very different from the sort of heavy-handed, gift-giving, paternalistic, we will endow you with certain resources and thereby set you up as a certain kind of person with a certain kind of subject position. It's an attempt not to say that people won't have subject positions or social structures, but to say that the state will not try to engineer those. It's, again, that minimalism, combined with what is in fact a very ambitious kind of maximalism, which is that the state will provision everybody in the society in some minimal way. So all of these are fascinating issues and will give me much to think about in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for participating in this very interesting discussion. And thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. Thank you.